thoughts and who've been reviewing the document is much appreciated. Um, and we will take the time we have. We won't just make time. So if for some reason, we get to where we get sooner, that's great, but we'll try to work through this. Todd and I had a great meeting with Sarah, who is the governor's representative on the board. So hopefully we can fold in some of that. And I don't know if Sarah's able to be on the call today. I know she's going to try. Um, and so are there any public comments? Oh,
I
Sarah's
have not
here.
received public comment. No.
And Sarah's here. So yay, thank you. We have not received public comments. Sarah's here. And we're going to turn it over to Lindsay to get kicking. And one thing I would ask Lindsay, if possible, I don't know about other people, but I like when we share the documents we're talking about together rather than look individually. I find if I have to look away on my computer, look all over the place, it's just easier if we go along, if that's possible. But that's my only request, but I will turn it over to you. You are on mute.
There we go. Okay. Yes, that's great. Thank you, Sherry. And thanks everyone for participating. This is the third, and this will be the final virtual planning session. So for next steps, where we're going is I am going to sort of come back and take another stab at the plan and the scorecard. And then I will be reaching out individually as well as doing some really targeted surveying to try to bring it to some closure. So that by the end of this month, you as a board are able to feel good about it and start moving forward with this as a plan and a scorecard. So that's next steps. I just wanted to touch on that. Sherry, I totally agree. We do want to share screen and make sure that we're following along. So we will have the revised scorecard and plan up as we go through each of these, as well as the roles and responsibilities, which you can see is on our agenda. So for today, we wanted to first come back to the roles and responsibilities, which you all as a board and stakeholders to the board spent some time on, starting with the retreat. And we haven't gotten back to that, and that's why we want to. So what we want to do very specifically is, where did you leave off? You would have, I think, discussed this at the March 7th, I'm going to say, or maybe it was the 14th meeting. And what we want to come back to is, of the roles and responsibilities, of which there are many, right, that are your mandates by federal and state, which of them really scream high impact in terms of the board actually being actively involved in that role or responsibility. So we're going to spend time on that because that might have implications on plan and scorecard, and we don't want to miss that. Then we will go back to the metrics. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and input. I got individual emails. I also created a Google Doc and then discovered that it was out of compliance with public meeting rules. And so apologies for that from me as the ignorant consultant for not understanding those processes. So if you tried to go in and add your notes or thoughts, I took it down because it is more important for us to discuss this in a meeting than to use a Google Doc, which is not as transparent. So that is that piece, but you did send in comments. And so there are changes that we've made and refinements that I've made based on your input. And so that's what we'll spend, again, the bulk of today on. We want to wrap up making sure that you all are caught up on where the Work Readiness Committee is heading and starting to go. And we have Work Readiness folks on today, so we'll be able to dive into that. Again, we want to just just sort of cross-check, will the direction that they're going align with, and should it be included more directly in the plan or in the metrics, because there's potential for that. And then finally, we just want to end, so I ask you to kind of just keep this in your head with very quick thoughts on how does any of this shift board committee structure going forward, how the board communicates with stakeholders and partner agencies and the governor's office, and staffing, right? So structure should follow the content, of course, of the plan and the scorecard. So we want to just wrap up with that. So it's a lot, but any questions or thoughts just on the agenda? No. Okay. So we are going to then dive right in to revisiting roles and responsibilities. I'm going to kind of integrate more of the recap and syncing when we get into the scorecard and the plan. So we're going to pull this up. And I've asked if Clay, I know you're on, if you can help us refresh on where you all left off in your discussions, because that will help us figure out where we need to go today. So Clay, I'm going to turn it to you to maybe just give that recap for everyone.
Well, it's actually very quick, Lindsay, or relatively so. We did have an opportunity to go over the roles and responsibilities, and I kind of walked the board through the various elements, how it was arranged and grouped, the fact that, what the changes were from the last time they saw it in terms of consolidating different items that were somewhat repetitive, while at the same time keeping all the source references. So where I combine things, you'll see at least a couple of sources. Indicated that it was, our best attempt at identifying, the implementer and the approval delegation concept, and also customer impact. Walked through a few examples of items in different categories, but we didn't talk in any great detail about individual items or, for example, focusing on high impact items. We didn't get into that at the last meeting. So that part can be dealt with today in the conversation, and we can see how that develops.
That's great. Thanks, Clay. Okay, so before we jump in here, and we're just going to go section by section, and we don't have a lot of time to do this, so just consider that this is kind of review and getting it into our heads. And this, of course, will be an ongoing exercise. It should be an ongoing exercise, right, for the board to just as you frequently and probably at every meeting need to look at your vision and mission and imperatives. There's probably a regular cadence of the board also reviewing roles and responsibilities. So this is ongoing, right? But I want to know, first of all, from any of you on the call, do you understand, or how would you define this exercise, quite honestly? Because when you look at the roles and responsibilities, even if you look at the first three under planning and priorities, what we have is customer impact, right? And so I don't want to make any assumptions about what we mean when we say high, medium, varies, low. I do want to make sure that everyone sort of understands what it is that we're going for here. So in your words, when you say high customer impact, for example, for the first one, what does that mean to you? And anyone can answer that.
Well, I think I missed that session. This is Sherry. So I'm not sure what they were thinking on the high, medium, but it would seem well, let me just back up. My understanding was we're trying to separate out what we, the WTDB, can have direct impact on and what we indirectly have impact on. So that was one thing that I thought we were doing, but it may be another part of this conversation. The other part with this chart was clarifying what is staff and what is board and what is heck and what it, because there's certain pieces of this chart here that get done in a fairly perfunctory way, and then there are certain pieces that are different than that. Does that make sense? So like from the first session, I thought that's what we were talking about, but I could be wrong. I did miss a session.
So thank you, Sherry, because that is exactly why I'm asking, is I do want to make sure everyone has a clear understanding of what are we doing here, right? And so that row says customer impact. And so that would be quite different from what you just described, Sherry, which is, does the board have direct impact over, or is it indirect impact? And so I want to make sure that if we need another column, or if that gets captured in the approval delegation column, right? Do we have direct impact or do we not have direct impact, or do we want direct impact? We need to make those decisions. David, can you shed some light on this? What's your perspective?
I can shed light, but my perspective on it is that we were trying to look at this. This was working out of the large chart of all of the things that the WTDB has from some source a responsibility to do. And in my mind, trying to prioritize the ones that frankly are more impactful on the people and businesses we're serving. So the middle one here, I think, is a good example where the Oregon Combined State Plan is a massive amount of work, something that is required by federal law. And if we're doing everything else, it doesn't have the same level of impact directly on the workers and businesses we serve as maybe the other decisions that are made around our strategic plan and things like that. So that's how I was thinking about it.
Okay, great. So that customer impact column, per David, how you're thinking of it is absolutely which of these have the highest, the most impact on our workers, job seekers, and employers. And that's how we're labeling that. So I think then, per Sherry's point, does the board have direct impact or influence over any one of these? Probably needs to be captured in the approval delegation column, right? Does that seem like a right move here? And the reason this might seem super processy and nitpicky, but I really want to make sure everybody's clear on what we're doing with these columns so that the board really does know between those two, where we have influence and impact and which has the highest impact on our customers. Clay.
So just another note, the customer impact to an extent from, when this was being put together, some of it did focus on where the board had more influence, although it wasn't specifically focused on that. And all of it is certainly subject to interpretation. So, where it's high, medium, low, or anything else, certainly, there's room for disagreement and for another take on what might be the best impact. As far as the only thing that I could add on board responsibility is where we do have it as a board staff, that is something that we have a little bit more control over. So that's a little bit of an indicator there, but easily we could add a column to indicate the influence, the relative influence of the board.
Okay. Sherry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to come back to the implementer, because part of the problem, I think, has been that it's not always clear who's the implementer. And I'm a little worried that board staff is too generic, like board leads. I know we have approval delegation, but even in the implementer, And the reason is because we had this conversation at the first session about illuminating, even for the board, the level of work that the staff is doing on our behalf or at our request. I mean, do you see what I'm saying? Like, we are not actually doing some pieces of this as the board. The board in its concept is doing it through the staff. So I just feel like the implementer section could be even a little even more specific, but that's
Mhm.
just me.
Mhm. And Sherry, when you say more specific, you really are saying it's not the label that we need more specificity on. It really is board staff is murky to you.
To me,
Mhm.
it's like, yeah, they do it at our behest, but who does it? Because
Mhm.
that would be the staff or some pieces of this we talked about last time are come from the heck. And so, we just want to clarify.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think, but I don't know.
And is this just for my sake? So board staff, right? WTDB staff, Todd, Clay, Aaliyah. Am I right about that? I'm. And then there's HEC staff
Right,
because the WTDB administratively sits inside of HEC.
right.
So HEC staff then also support various, of implementation of these roles and responsibilities. And so the confusion is, but who, and do we need clarity for some of these on, is this board staff supporting the board and the board's interests as a governor's board, or are there staff implementing that are doing the work because it sits inside of HEC?
It only matters in the sense that it would be helpful to have clear understanding, and
Mhm.
then it'd be helpful for us to communicate to the board how this all works, just from a clarity. Because when we say like broadly, it doesn't capture it. And then it would be helpful for us to understand what elements of the board are dependent on HEC, which is not a bad or good. I mean, it's a neutral comment. It would just be helpful to understand,
Yeah. Okay,
Mhm.
great. Todd, you have your hand up.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just thinking similarly, Sherry. It seems like three chunks might work. HEC overall, which is super broad, but then Office of Workforce Investments, where the WTDB is housed within HEC, and then maybe board staff as three key chunks. That
Mhm.
HEC piece could either also be a bit further refined depending, but I think most of this, Sherry and Lindsay will be around board staff, Clay and I and Aaliyah, mostly Clay and I, as the only two board staff, and then other folks in code, which is
Okay.
the Office of Workforce Investment. Sorry.
Mhm. Okay. Okay, that's great. So let's leave that there for now. But I think that's very helpful to at least, we're going to come back at some point, and this might happen behind the scenes. We'll also do some survey work related to this. That's going to be follow-up, so expect that. But in the implementer column, even to get more specific for each one around HEC, Office of Workforce Investment, or board staff, which really includes Clay and Todd, right? Would be helpful clarity for board members to understand implementation. Venkat?
Lindsay, I just had a follow-up question on that last column, customer impact, because to me, I don't know how this column will be used. I would assume that all of our customers are important. This work is important because it's required by statute, or we are serving one of our customers, whether it's a direct customer or a secondary customer. How would that impact data be used?
That's a great question. And I don't have a direct answer for that, and I'm curious if we can come up with one, because when we were at the retreat, the question on the table was, of all of these, of the 60, right, or so roles and responsibilities per federal and state statute, how do we begin to understand which ones really do need the influence, this is coming back, right, to approval delegation column, of the board, right? And which do we really feel like we can delegate? So the columns are not mutually exclusive of each other. And getting to the customer impact, high, medium, or low, does that, the question, right? Does that inform approval delegation that the board wishes to see? And that influences who then is responsible for implementation. Does that make sense? Does that seem right? It's sort of a feedback from right to left.
Lindsay, I'm wondering, would it help to have Aaliyah scroll down a little bit and see a little bit more of it?
Sure.
Maybe?
Yep, absolutely. So let's stop here. So we have some good examples of potentially low, medium, and high impact on your customer. So if you even just chose one, establishing criteria for use by chief elected officials in local areas for appointment of members on the local boards, you see that as potentially having relatively low impact on your end customer compared to developing strategies for aligning technology and data systems, right? I mean, I could see that. And so therefore, does that categorization of low help you as a board make decisions about delegation and implementer responsibility? And
Okay,
again,
I think that helps
help with that?
clarify.
Okay.
It does.
Mhm.
It's really meant to be, what can the board delegate to staff? What's important enough that the board feels they want to delegate to staff? It's not that we might drop this entirely, because it's still required to do by statute, right?
Exactly. Ultimately, a state workforce board is responsible for all of these. So the question is, how do you stay informed enough and make informed decisions enough about which of these you are clearly delegating and at what level, right? And to who, so that you're able to track, versus which of these actually are critical enough to actual board member activities that you keep those close to the chest. Yeah. So here's what I'd like to propose. I would like to just sort of quickly look at the ones that already say high, as in potentially high impact over our customers. And your customers, job seekers, workers, employers, this is customers of the system, right? And also agency partners, local workforce development boards, and the community-based organizations that partner with them. So that's the list of customers that you all listed out at the retreat, and I think that has stuck. And so if we just skim through the high and do a cross check, I want that to just be in our heads to inform any decisions we make today about the scorecard and the strategic plan. This will be an imperfect exercise because there are a lot, right? So it's just going to take some brain power here. And know then that much of the individual outreach and survey work that happens after this will refocus on, are we getting the columns labeled right? Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So the strategic plan was a high one. If we look at this page, high is strategies for aligning technology and data systems across one-stop partner programs to enhance service delivery. So I'm just going to make sort of a note of that. And the other one on this page, advise the governor on matters pertaining to the use of WIOA funds. Sherry?
Yeah, see, I'm still getting, oh, don't go back to where you were. I'm still getting tripped up on this because this one, the high one, for it does have high impact for the consumer. Develop strategies for aligning technology and data systems across. That is not, I mean, like for me, for the board, like that is something that we want to see done, that absolutely has a high impact, but there are like 10 other you know, agencies or invested parties who actually make that happen, and who in making that happen, that measurement really comes from that. So that I keep coming back to being a little concerned about things that are so big that and have so many other players that we can't measure how we did. And so that worries me with that one. It is high for consumer. Don't get me wrong, but is it where I know it says informal delegated, but it just, I don't know, so anyway, that's just one. But then conversely, the consult with the governor or advise the governor on matters pertaining to the use of innovation funds. That is like, yes, that is big for consumers and right in our wheelhouse, and we can, follow the thread right to our impact. So anyway, that I keep struggling with that difference.
Mm-hmm. And so
And
I'm
that doesn't mean we have
wondering,
we don't have to go down too far down the rabbit hole on that, but it just.
yeah, but I think that I do think this is important work to be done. And so if we even make a small dent today in this, that's progress. And so part of this, I think, does then go back to what is the customer impact column? And even if what you said is true, Sherry, that the board itself does not necessarily feel like it has influence over strategies to align technology and data systems.
Well,
Still,
we may have influence over saying this is important. We need
yeah,
you to do it.
yeah,
But that's almost where we end. It's like where our
yeah,
arm ends, where somebody else's arm begins. That's all.
yeah. Right, which is the theme that is important, right? Similar to how you were discussing accountability and metrics last time of how are we self-measuring even our actions that get the right work done, because others are then the extension of, right? So is it fair that can still be a high impact on customer, but it doesn't mean that board members have direct influence and impact over making that happen? And again, this goes to Venkat's question. What is the utility of a customer impact column? Why do we want that? And if that stays as high, because we see that as having high impact on our customers, but it's still delegated to agency directors and local board directors, is that okay? I mean, is that a problem or is that okay?
So my concern, just to be clear, is not that these things that are enumerated on the left-hand side aren't things. They are, in fact, enumerated things that we're supposed to do. My concern is us backing ourselves into a metrics corner that doesn't work well for us or isn't descriptive and isn't helpful. That's all.
Clay, did you have a comment?
No, sorry.
Okay, nope, that's okay. So I guess the question then is, I mean, I'm wondering how useful this exercise is, quite honestly. You know, and if this is something that we set aside and we come back to this via survey and individual input. I'm worried that we will not be able to get all through this. My understanding is, so Clay, the low, medium, high, remind us how those were created to get us to this point. Were these sort of best guesses at this point?
Yeah, I would say best guesses. I
Okay.
think that the focus that I had in originally drafting them was sort of workforce system impact. To Sherry's point, it wasn't necessarily tied to the board.
Mhm.
But there was some board influence to whether, to whether it was high or low as well. Because these are board responsibilities. And so there was some consideration for that. So that's kind of where they were. Best guesses is probably the short answer to it.
Okay. Okay. So again, the customer impact column is impact on customer by the system. It's not by the board. It's by the system, right? Where the influence of the board comes in is in the approval delegation column, is what we said, right? And so that's where the board has choices of how much control do we want over this piece. So I think, Sherry, to your point, if we just took the strategies for aligning technology and data systems, it would, this actually seems to track with what you suggested, is that in fact, the board does not have and may not need big influence over that. That is an agency director and local board director responsibility, even though it's high impact on the customer of the system.
Yeah, I was just being
Right.
literally almost literal and practical in the sense that I'm thinking of a future date where somehow these end up metrics were measured by, and they can't be. I mean, that
Yeah.
particular thing is not, that's all. I just
Yeah.
want to make sure we don't get tripped up
Yes.
in that
Yes.
way.
Right. Right. So the exercise is not to create 60 new metrics, one for each of these. Right. This is simply an exercise of, do we know enough about the roles and responsibilities, who it appropriately is delegated to, and how much influence the board as board members actually want? And that's going to be in that approval delegation column. Okay. Okay, great. So at this point then, do we actually want to look at this to inform the plan and the metrics discussion? Or was this enough, do you think, for this now? And we, like I said, I design an exercise that is more survey to make sure we have the columns labeled right. Any strong responses to that? Hi, please go ahead.
I guess to your question, I think this table is really helpful in just looking at, what roles and responsibilities the board has. I think the conversations still should be about the board measures and, what are the key measures we want to move. And it's hard because I think this table talks about customer being kind of Oregonians, I think, like ultimate, like how does the work, how are Oregonians impacted by this? But I think if we're thinking about board performance measures, we have to think about the board's customers, which directly is, maybe our impact to, or like this, the workforce board's impact to local workforce boards and, the governor and like the smaller, because we talk about like big population indicators and defining what those are by the board. And then as a board, making sure that the board supports its customers. So identifying what those performance metrics look like, and then helping other entities that belong to this partnership, right? All of our partners across the state understand that they also have customers that they're serving, and that those metrics should be tied to their specific customer. And then if we work in alignment with each other, all supporting, the customers that we are responsible for impacting, then we can move the system that way. Like, if that makes sense.
I think it does make sense. And I think it also does help make the case for us to refocus on the plan and the scorecard, because that, in fact, then informs choices about this. Yeah. So we had it kind of reverse.
Yeah. I think these are like strategies. This is like the means to the end. But I think what we need to do is define what the end is, like align on what the end is. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, good. Let's just hear a couple more comments, Julia, and then Todd, if you still had a comment, and then we're going to go to the plan and the scorecard.
Yeah, I was going to add, I see how you just described that progression. I think it makes sense. And I think this should be a robust conversation about this. I'm fine with the survey as long as there's a big conversation afterwards, because this is what the board is actually going to do. And I think that's the most important thing.
Great. Okay. Yep. Fair request. Okay.
I think everybody's points are well taken. One of the things, super practical, and I like the idea of the survey and getting on to the next bit of work. One thing I thought that might help, I mean, these are really important. I agree with Julia. And it was intended as its original purpose to just specifically have a document where board members could go to better understand what their jobs as volunteer board members are as a resource. To Sherry's point, getting super practical, maybe at the top of the document, it says something like, these are not meant to be metrics. These are not, our measurables, just to, be clear about that. So we, to your point, Sherry, don't get at some point in the future tied to metrics that we really can't, influence, control, drive to improve or decrease, depending on, what the metrics are. That's it.
Great. Okay. Great. Well, I do think that was probably worthwhile. So let's switch over. Aaliyah, if you can now go to, thank you. So some changes were made just based on the feedback that we got actually during the last session, as well as feedback that I got via email. And Lori, to your question, yes, there were the comments that were made in the Google Doc before I took it down. I did capture to answer that. So this will not be yes. This will not be too arduous here. I think what you will have to decide is if this feels like the right level for the first page, or if it's too much, etc. But it does include everything that you all have talked about, and so making some changes to the mission. Including making sure we're using the word workforce instead of people and job seekers, making sure that we really are highlighting inclusivity across this first page. So that includes putting it directly into reputation. There is an added bullet there that we added, inclusive. We inform and advise leadership and system partners on the need and the ways to include all Oregonians in the workforce system. We also made sure that inclusivity was built in to the bold and innovative. And now I'm in, so especially under vision and action. So encourage taking calculated risks and innovative approaches to overcome workforce challenges and barriers to inclusivity, pushing beyond traditional boundaries to find effective solutions. So those were really the only changes that were made on this first page. Any strong thoughts, comments, or questions before we jump into the imperatives, objectives, and metrics? Sherry?
I love a one pager. I think, Todd, if I'm not mistaken, I was the driver a long time ago behind the one page situation. And so as one pager goes, I think it is good. You know, I like that you can easily see the vision, the position, the reputation, the values. And I like it, me personally, but I'm a big fan of a one pager. So
Great. Okay, good. Any other strong thoughts, comments, questions? Ken, please.
Yeah, I was just going to echo Sherry's comments, and I know when we came out with the one pager, it took the nation by storm in that other boards across the state or across the country. I was actually even invited to speak to Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin on how we developed the one pager, and I know the National Governors Association held it out as a standard to live by.
Excellent. Okay, good. Getting lots of reactions that this is feeling very strong. Okay. Well then, let's move to the next page. And we're going to dig in a little further, right? So this is the same exercise, everyone. No surprises here, right? But each time we do this, we get a little bit more refined. And so I want to just sort of walk you through some of the changes based on last Friday, and then the input that I have received individually, as well as dropped into the document. So some refinements for sure for imperative number 1, no changes to the imperative itself nor the objectives, but really trying to figure out the population indicators and the performance metrics. I want to just put a reminder out there that Soup introduced us right to the 2 different kinds of metrics, population indicators and performance. David, you also, I think, have highlighted the importance of what are the actual shared outcomes that we're going for versus the performance metrics of both the board and the system. So those probably can be called out, and we can come up with a format for a scorecard that clarifies those. Know that both of those concepts are integrated together in here, but that theme, I think, for all of you has resonated and stuck, that we need these 2 types of metrics. So for imperative number 1, there were no changes or strong feelings on participation rate by groups, and the percent increase based on proportional to population, which in fact, some folks were quite excited about the idea of, can we get to a point where we are baselining and then measuring improvements based on population groups proportional to the bigger population. So the how and the nitty-gritty of that will happen behind the scenes, right? Now the question that I have is which groups, right? Everybody has that question. But I do think that all of you on the phone or on the Zoom today also have answers to that. I mean, you already measure, and I know that local workforce boards measure and collect data by population and target population groups. And so I did want to just check in with everybody and have a few minutes of discussion around that. Who can rattle off which groups we already are measuring? And then just curious thoughts on how do we understand which groups we're not measuring and we need to measure, because I'm sure that some of you even may have that in your head. So I want to open that up for discussion. So any of you data analysis and gurus, and Julia, you might have this in your head actually, of who, the system already measures by certain groups. For the good of the order, can we run through those? Kurt, please.
Well, I can't touch on everything the system measures already, but I would say that from the WIOA perspective, each of the programs that are authorized under the first four titles of WIOA are all responsible for tracking things at the federal level. And then, so that's like and then at the state level, if you want to count like what Prism collects or things like that, that's a next level down, but I couldn't speak to to that because I'm not a part of Prism exactly. So as you go more into the broader system than just like the public workforce system part that we talked about, I lose track of what all is connected. I'm not or collected, excuse me. I don't know what all is collected by other programs that are not in the big six.
Yeah, I think that's what Kurt said is right. But I think generally race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, probably English language learners, and rural, urban, age, gender. Those
Income,
are probably pretty standard.
Okay. Okay. So
And
currently,
there's
oh, go ahead.
disability. There's lots of other things. And I apologize. I had some noise in the background and missed the initial question. I don't know if you can restate that for me.
Yes. So the initial question was what groups are already tracked, and then what
Okay.
groups do we want to track, and how do we get there?
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, both Kurt and they both already covered that very well, what we capture. I'm trying to think. We've got race, ethnicity, disability, homelessness, veteran status. I think those were just a couple that weren't already covered.
Okay. Okay, great. So then the next question of what groups do we want to track, or how would we, and what data and information do we need to answer that question? And you don't need to have the right answer. We just need the brainstormed answer of what data and information do we need to be able to answer the question, what does the board want to be able to track in terms of participation, completion rates, employment retention? That is not being tracked already, or do we feel good about the fairly standard, right, but comprehensive federal and state categories? Jason?
Thanks, Lindsay. I just wanted to ask broadly for the analysts, but yes, in terms of demographic questions being asked, they can be relatively consistent across programs. I'm still not clear on how sober we are on how much we actually collect proportional to how many we serve. And so I just want to point out that that collection of demographic information may not be uniform across programs. And for some of our larger programs, it may be very little collected. And so we might have information that can fill a chart and a graph, but it may represent a very small portion of the population that we're actually serving. Mm-hmm. That's sometimes all we have to work with, but I just want to put it out there that there are limitations to how much we're actually collecting from clients and customers across the state.
Okay. So that's really important, right? Is that there is an extensive list of categories that are tracked and reported, but what you're saying, Jason, is that it is inconsistent, and so we don't necessarily have a full picture of the data from even some of the bigger programs. Brenda, Prism has the ability to collect a wide array of demographics. Not all partners in Prism currently provide the demographic data that PRISM is set up to collect. So that seems an important piece. Venkat?
Lindsay, I was wondering, given the groups that need to be tracked, if there is data, and maybe there is, but a comprehensive tracking of barriers like childcare access or housing stability or mental health needs, because this would align with the governor's priorities and what we want to do as a board and have data proactively ready. If this is already collected, great. If not, it can be curated to answer that question. That would be great as well.
Okay. So let's jump to that, Venkat, and that is just in imperative number 2 potentially, and what we sort of honed in on here is what shared workforce goals do you want to test out? And I really do encourage all of you to consider that this is some big stuff, right? And so this is testing. It's testing systems' ability to track it. It's testing the partner's ability to track these things, and your ability as a board, right, to set these measures and then make recommendations to leadership to ask and demand for these. So one of them certainly was that came out of last week's conversation related to housing. And you spent some time last week talking about, but what is the slice or what is the workforce relevant metric related to a housing priority of the governor, for example? And so what we have here is one test example, reduction in housing. You'll look at number 3 of the second imperative. Reduction in housing insecurity among low to middle income workers. So for some background context, why is it reduction in income insecurity, right? And why low to middle income workers? Now, part of the conversation in the past 2 sessions has been, we're not responsible for housing. We're not going to get into housing vouchers and, et cetera. But is there a workforce housing component here? And so that then does potentially indicate low to middle income workers. So does the work that the workforce system have an impact in those workers' ability to secure affordable workforce housing? That's going to rise above the level of very extreme low income housing, right? That your housing department is responsible for. But it tackles a segment of housing need that, in my experience across the country, is not often tackled, right? And this requires looking at average median income, right? And comparing, as suggested last week, as a baseline. If you go to the targets, you'll see 3A, baseline metric. Do we have an understanding of the ratio of median income to median housing costs in Oregon? And can that then be broken down, perhaps by local workforce board region, because it's going to vary? And then does that provide us a baseline to measure reduction in housing insecurity by group to measure against? There's another piece here of, and do we want to add on to that in-demand industry and occupations, i.e., do the workers and job seekers we serve in the workforce and larger system, right? If we have a shared metric here, if we tracked those by in-demand industry or in-demand occupations, which you spent a lot of time last week talking about how important that is for this board to pay attention to, can we layer that into reductions in housing insecurity for low to middle income? Sherry, thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to add a teeny bit of nuance here, coming back to the discussion about housing.
Okay.
Very much like childcare, no, we don't want to get into vouchers and things like that. But I think back to our customer, the governor, if we're able to say there are levels to workforce housing, as we know, one of which is the creation of the housing, but the other is the impact on workforce. Like, in other words, one of the housing justifications that we could give the governor for the rest of her work is that we are finding, which I had heard several years ago, actually, from some communities outside of our metro area, that they can't keep doctors because they don't have housing. Like that is a workforce housing result. So I don't want us to get confused between, like you said, vouchers and that, and the way, and then there's workforce housing workforce, which is the workforce that creates the housing, right? So I just want to make sure that we are capturing, when we talk about something like housing, all elements of workforce so that we can give the best advice and counsel for the government. It's like, yes, we don't have enough housing. Okay, that's one level. Second level, we don't have enough people to develop or build the housing. That's another level. Third level is our lack of housing is impacting our workforce in this negative way, right? And so that then is all workforce. So I just want to bring that nuance to that.
So Sherry, that is 3 areas potentially. One, not enough affordable housing, right? 2, there's something about the actual building of and construction of, right? Which is
And
the
that workforce,
construction
yeah.
workforce. Yep. And then third, are we having an impact enough on job seekers and workers in Oregon that they are able to increase income and therefore job security, or housing costs are going down because supply is going up? I mean, right, we're getting it, but what do we want to measure here that will
Well, I think
best support?
the second thing is the housing workforce, the force that builds the housing. I think Stephen had talked about that. Like, there's this big imperative to have more diversity. Well, we don't even know what the force looks like. So that's a workforce. But the final thing is, how is our lack of housing impacting our ability to maintain, and this is what employers talk about, to maintain and recruit a workforce. Like, so that is the piece that I know for a fact employers care about. So that's what I'm talking about. Like, each 3 of those have different things we are examining, and we're getting information so that, because I just feel like when we talk about workforce, we want to make sure we're giving, especially to the governor, a really good data set about not just one piece of it. It's like a domino, so that the governor has what she needs to make the decision. So this information may exist already. I'm not saying we have to create it new. It's probably somewhere else. But anyway, Sarah is with the governor. So I'll let Sarah say what the governor needs.
I was thinking, because I really, this is a rich conversation, and I wonder, my recommendation would be, so it sounds like, we'll use housing as an example, but you could argue, to your good point, Sherry, that, our healthcare workforce, behavioral health is another priority of the governor's, and we have a behavioral health workforce crisis, both insofar as we don't have enough workers, but I imagine some of the same challenges are arising in terms of workforce housing. So connecting it to that, but I would focus the measurement of, like, the central measure that y'all are wanting to kind of pick as the workforce pipeline. So what is this board doing to create more using housing construction workforce to advance kind of the governor's priorities more broadly? And I think you can contextualize that with the other data. So contextualize that with, we know that we need workforce housing too. So, you might not solely focus on collecting. I would just center the worker. So center the worker and the workforce pipeline. And then from there, you can contextualize the data with some of the other things. I just wouldn't necessarily, I think it could get muddied if the board starts to do too much in thinking about the other measures, because I know that, our, housing and community, or housing agency does a lot of measurement and wouldn't want us to get bogged down in that.
Okay, this is really helpful, and Sep, maybe you can add to this as well. I want to make just one comment, just make sure I've heard it right. So this also sort of introduces not necessarily impact and performance metrics, but the data, obviously, that contextualizes what we're measuring the system and ourselves against. So contextualized data would be, what do we know about the lack of affordable housing? What do we know about the lack of affordable housing for our high demand industries, for example, and the impact on the employers in those high demand industries? Those would be contextualized data points that then, right, would lead to, so what impact measures do we want to focus on, including pipeline of construction, the housing construction workforce, right? And perhaps perhaps others. Sup, what are your thoughts at this point?
I just want, I like Sarah's point that we should focus the metric on the workforce system, this particular thing. And we could even say something as simple as like the metric we want is unemployment rate by demographic group. I know we're not, of course, solely responsible for all the employment or unemployment, and that's of course multiple factors. But if that's our population indicator, or am I getting confused? Is the target column the population indicator targets?
So
That you're referring to?
it is mixed, but if you look at imperative 2 and if you just look at the housing, what's under targets right now are population indicators 1 through 3 are population indicators. 4 and 5 are the performance metrics, and that correlates with the target column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what is being suggested now, right, are contextualized data points, right, that can either go in a scorecard or not, right, but would inform recommendations and sort of be the make the case that certain metrics are going to be important to track. But Sup, I think your question does sort of raise, is a population indicator possible with construction workforce pipeline, right? We can come up with something there. But is there also a metric that measures, sorry, I'm having to think hard about this, that measures changes in housing insecurity, right? Or ability of workers in high demand industries to afford housing, right? Is there a metric there that over some longer term can demonstrate that the workforce system has had an impact on increasing the number of job seekers and workers in living wage, high demand sectors so that they have reductions in housing insecurity? That's, I think, a question for you all to decide, right? Is that as a second metric potentially, right? If we were to just test out some housing metrics here, 1, something to do with construction workforce pipeline. 2, have we had an impact on job seekers and workers in high demand industries enough so they are actually able to beat that ratio and rise above that ratio of, can we afford, right? Median income to median housing price. Am I crazy here, or is that?
Would that be a wage metric, Lindsay?
It probably would be. Yeah.
I get worried about getting into like housing supply metrics. Like that doesn't seem like our job. Our job that could be contextualizing of like, well, we're doing this because we need more housing supply and we know we need more workers, and you can contextualize it. But to me, that layered down would be increasing wages and economic mobility of that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And I'm gonna put it in chat. I was thinking about this more and thinking about possible population indicators. And yeah, you're right. My first thought on improving affordable housing is average wages. So I wonder if we could do
And so if you squint and you can see what you have discussed in the past is that, or it's in that same category. So if you look at number 1 under imperative number 2, target number 1, it's percent by group, clear agreement on the definition of living wage and benefits, right? It's been suggested that if there isn't agreement on living wage, then we just go above median wage, but it's a percent increase by group in median wage or living wage. And again, layering that into our high demand industries. That's number 1. If we were to also apply that to a set of housing metrics, would one of them be that increase in living wage or median wage has allowed more people to make the cut, right, to afford housing, which is where the ratio of median housing price and median wage becomes important as a contextual baseline data piece. So the choice is, how many of these, how much, and what's going to make the biggest statement and support, right? So Venkat, and then Venkat, you had your hand up, and then David.
Yeah, Lindsay, I just threw another comment in the chat, and that was, since employers are a large group of people that we serve, to have an industry-led metric, which is targeted by industry sector workforce gaps, and pick these high demand sectors, whether it's manufacturing, technology, healthcare, construction, etc., and then use those to formulate the basis of our recommendations to the governor, if that's useful to her.
Mm-hmm. So separate from housing, Venkat, and you did say this last week too, so I do want to just spend a minute on this. There's nowhere in your scorecard right now that actually measures gap closing, right? In terms of supply of workers and demand from your high demand sectors and occupations. And so straight up, that is a metric that's missing here. Yes.
Agreed. And
Yes.
so we're doing something similar to that with the semiconductor technology sector in Oregon. So we have current gaps and projected workforce gaps, given the number of people entering the workforce, like the number of students who are graduating from our universities, and how much we think there's going to be attrition in industry. So we're able to project out for the next 10 years and say this is where the gap's going to be, and then use that as a basis for providing recommendations on how to address that gap. So it'll be valuable, in my opinion, if we were to do this across different sectors.
Great. Okay, great. Noted. David, before we go to you, I also want to just highlight Jason's comment, which again is related to how are we just creating a metric that tracks our construction. So pre-apprenticeship completers, construction employment, number of apprentices entering or completing construction apprenticeships. David, what are your thoughts on this conversation?
A couple thoughts. One, on what Venkat just said, I do think that, and there's a bunch of methodologies, but I like that idea of measuring the closing of the gap. And I know that, for instance, the research shop here at the employment department does its long-term projections of gaps. So we could build a metric around having that gap close between, the 2025 and 2026 projection or whatever, particularly focusing on industries, on the focus industries. So I think that is an important measure. I think there's good data points out there and probably good tools that already get us pretty much all the way there to being able to measure it. On the kind of living wage, you said most of what I was going to, which is I think that metric there for the living wage gets really close. And I do think then if we're targeting it, I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. Living wage, I would think, would encapsulate housing.
Mhm.
I'm sure there are other ways of coming up with something that is more directly focused just on housing. If you wanted to say, percentage of people in this population that are making at least X% of the median home price. I'm and this may be getting too complex, but it seems like there might be a way to tie that to the industries also, because I think different industries have different needs even within the different areas. So again, I don't think we can realistically say we want to, well, we certainly can't say we want everybody to make above the average wage so that they can all afford houses. But if we want to say we particularly want to make it more affordable for people in these high priority industries to be able to afford housing, because that's where we see the biggest challenges within recruiting and maintaining the workforce that we need. To me, those seem like some really focused measures. They could tie back to governor's priorities, and the same metrics could be used if a local board had an additional priority occupation. They could measure it the same way with a different group.
Yes. Yes. So you're getting a lot of thumbs up, and I think what you're doing is demonstrating how these are very connected, right? So again, even if we just look at imperative number 2 and we look at the metrics and the targets there, if we have a shared workforce goal of increasing employment in above living wage jobs, and in demonstrated high demand industries, right, then living wage and that definition, probably by region, has to incorporate housing costs. So potentially, if you were able to come up with the right metrics and regionalize them, I could imagine we have some understanding of our healthcare workers in Bend able to afford housing compared to, right, their median income and the median home price of housing in Bend. And therefore, what changes or recommendations do we make around that, right? And you could disaggregate that in many ways. So the living wage metric becomes important. Again, it is a reduction in housing insecurity metric of some sort, but again, by region and industry, high demand industry. Sup.
Could it be something like the percentage of households living in affordable homes? Because then it would take into account the variations in the different areas for salary and cost of living.
Okay. Now, again, I mean, the work to be done is where does this data exist? Organizing the contextual and baseline data, per Sarah's, I think, very good point. And then where does the data exist by region, by industry that can demonstrate the impact of the lack of affordable housing on industry, right? Which, Sherry, was your point, and therefore the changes potentially if people are able to access living wage, including housing prices, jobs, or advance in. Okay, how many brains are hurting right now? So I guess then my question is, how far off are we? Some of what you're saying is really confirming that we at least have the right-ish goals here, but we need to organize in terms of what contextualized and baseline data we would need, and therefore how we would measure changes in or percents, I guess, for living wage, and what that means for people affording housing. And then come up with a metric very specifically around the construction pipeline, right? Question about the construction pipeline. Is this breakdown and pushing more job seekers and workers into residential construction? Or is that too specific? Or I'm curious about the construction workforce pipeline metrics that you would want to see. Jason had, ideas basically on how are we really accelerating enrollment and completion of construction apprenticeships, et cetera. Any other metrics that would really matter there? And maybe not. So Julia, housing production workforce, you put in the chat. So
I do think it should focus on residential. Okay. And I think, but I think it shouldn't just be construction. It could also include like permitting and surveying and stuff like that.
Okay. Okay, great.
And yeah, I agree with what Lori Silverman said. The number of workers there are compared to the number that are needed.
Yep, right. Gap closing.
Mm-hmm. And that's where the other context matters in the gap closing. Like, so what we can say is with the gap, some of the factors we know go into the gap is like chicken and egg, is housing, or some of the things that go into the gap are childcare. Like, and it's not our goal to fix those things, or but highlighting what goes into the gap is would be good.
Mm-hmm. So that to me says there is a pretty, I was about to say simple, it's never simple, but there is a pretty straightforward metric, performance metric for the board itself related to how is the board pulling together the right data, contextualized and baseline data that makes the case and forms recommendations around the housing production workforce, and potentially the metrics related to living wage and increasing opportunities for the workforce in Oregon to afford housing. So there's a performance metric for the board that is, how well are we doing in pulling together the data and making reports and recommendations? Lori?
Well, I think this is where my biggest concern lies with some of this population work. I was so enthusiastic last week about this direction that we're going. This week looks different than last week in so many ways. But, so much of our data collection is driven by the federal government, right? I am pulling up a fantastic report from the Oregon Employment Department around the aging and declining workforce. And they have a gorgeous bar graph naming the Oregon workers by age category, right? And it says the source is the Oregon Employment Department and the U.S. Census Bureau. My concern, but the age categories are 14 to 18, 19 to 21, 22 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, and it goes on. And then it's 45 to 54, and then 55 to 64, and 65 to 99. No, and the only demographic, the only age demographic that increased from 92 to 22 was the 55 and over population. But we've lumped so many decades of age into those categories. And my fear is it's being driven by the federal government and how they're collecting the data, and we have to follow as a state that direction. How do we break that structural barrier if that is a real barrier? We know our population is changing. We know it's getting more diverse. We know the federal government doesn't collect as diverse race ethnicity. Then we want to track. How do we do that moving forward?
So yeah, great points, right? And again, that goes back to um, lots of groups are being tracked, and that report is probably a great example, right, of the breakdown of what's being tracked, but it's not being tracked in a way that may tell us the full story. And then what are the implications on that for the data that you want to collect as a board? So noted. Stoop, do you have a comment or thought on that?
Yeah. Are you saying that we want to get more breakup of that data, and we can't because it's not required by the federal government, not funded in that way?
What I'm saying is I don't know, but I do know that so much of our data collection is driven by the federal government. I don't want those limitations to be passed down through to our Oregon data collection
Right.
if it doesn't meet the WTDB's board objectives.
Yeah. So we can, I guess the board can decide, how it wants to do that. And assuming that there's funding to get that level and that you don't get it now, maybe it was just cut up that way for the reporting, or we just don't have that level because it's not funded. I don't know. David probably knows more.
Todd, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to confirm, Sarah, my head really does hurt, and Lindsay has been very brave doing this on a Friday afternoon. It occurred to me, though, just a little historical context. I think so much of what I'm hearing really depends on that clear, agreed definition of living wage, Lindsay. Venkat, I think, can appreciate this. You raised it in a meeting several years ago. $1 above median wage does not equal what most people intuitively would consider a high wage job. I think there's a fair amount that could be done to maybe think about things from that living wage perspective, and maybe a goal or a target in here, somewhere in here, there could be just a practical goal of formally define and adopt a living wage definition. I think that could clear things up, at least in my brain. And I think it would help with maybe perception of what we mean by those words, and perhaps what we mean by high wage jobs. I don't know if that made sense, but
It does. But so what you're suggesting, Todd, is a serious revisit, right? Of what is living wage? Does it really have an impact? The current definition, by your example of $1 above, right? And the definitions of high wage. So making sure that we revisit and approve definitions of that somehow. And it seems that there is information out there related to that, but are you suggesting that it has not yet been sort of approved, accepted?
yeah, I think
codified?
This is right. and I would lean on some of the folks at OED that have been around a little longer than I have. Maybe Kurt remembers, but if memory serves correctly, sometime back in the 90s, the State Workforce Board, it was OWIB then, formally approved the definition of what Oregon means when they say high wage job. And if memory also serves correctly, the definition was anything above a median wage job. But if you look at what currently a median wage job by that definition, or a high wage job by that definition in Portland equals, I'm not sure any of us sitting here listening to that number would go, oh, that's a high wage job. I think Venkat is smiling because I remember previously years ago at a meeting, Venkat, you said, well, $38,000 is not a high wage job in the Portland metro area, so that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Okay.
Jason might have an idea here. He raised his hand.
Yes. Jason, is your comment related to the living wage? Or did you have another comment? And then David also has his hand up.
Yeah, and this is, it's been, I think Todd is correct. It's been many moons since the workforce system has got together to re-enroll in what we all agree upon as the definition. And it's not just the Workforce Board, it's the Oregon Department of Education involved, Oregon Higher Ed, and the Oregon Employment Department all have the same definition of what high wage is, so that we're consistent, since a lot of these programs tie into WIOA definitions of self-sufficiency and in-demand careers. And one thing to note, and I think that one of the challenges that we face, and this is something that Todd, Sherry, and I had worked on back in 2019 for a minute, is that when we look at things like our employment records and the outcomes from PRISM programs and outcome measures of wages and wages earned and wage gain, that measures about 50 to 60% of the story for a lot of workers when it comes to the living wage. Because living wage is a measure of my benefits, my health insurance, my retirement, my child care, if that employer provides that. And that's a story that none of our records and administrative information have information for. So where, as in Portland, we might see, a median wage in the, $30 range or something like that. The reality is that that's about 65% of the story, and that employers are providing anywhere between 25 to 40% more that account for health insurance, that account for child care. And it's a part of the story that we simply do not see through our national surveys, through administrative records. And that's a challenge and a tension upon the process of how we want to serve Oregonians, how we want to promote better jobs, but also the information that we actually have access to. So I think that there's always a benefit to re-enrolling what we consider is important, but also understanding that there's a big hole in the information that we have access to administratively and through data sources.
Okay. So Jason, but you're making the case that this has not been revisited recently. It sounds like it certainly hasn't been revisited post-COVID, right? Which is isn't that always our demarcation of timeline and when to revisit things? And we will absolutely run into gaps and holes in the data, but still an opportunity is here to revisit and agree to some level of what does it mean to be living wage. And again, back to a housing priority related to workforce, the implications then of what the workforce system is pushing toward and promoting in their high demand industries related to that definition.
Yeah, and I just add, in terms of considerations of numbers, median wages is certainly interesting, various versions of living wage, but one other consideration in terms of values that might be of interest to the board in terms of comparison would be looking at the average wage of homeowners. Yes, I'm making above the median wage, but that is not necessarily tied to whether or not I can own a house and where I live. So that might be also another comparison that might be helpful.
Okay, great. Okay, I want to make sure, David, you can weigh in, and then I want to come back Venkat, you put something in the chat related to some suggestions for performance metrics. I want to come back to that. And Sarah, I want to come back to your Colorado example because we want to hear a little bit more about that. So David, go ahead.
And I think Jason just proved most of what I was going to say, which is we have some people that are great at knowing what data is out there and what we can do. And maybe we set as a discrete target for the state board that we come up with a revised metric of how to measure housing affordability that can then be used across particular high demand industries and targeted populations. Because I think looking at exactly what Jason just said, you could do, you know, what's the ratio of salaries to home price in a particular area or within a range. There are those data limitations, but to the point that Lori was making, we do have more data in Oregon than just the national data. There's still limits and there's advantages when it lines up perfectly with the federal definitions, because then you can start matching things. And similarly, when we match across different state programs, you get a lot of advantages if you're using the same breakdowns, because you can pull the data in and just get a lot more out of the analysis. So I was going to, maybe we have a work group that gets tasked with coming up with a good measure. And if so, I would encourage it to work with other agencies, because I know that there, I mean, in the healthcare and all kinds of other areas, there's similar worries about what does it take to live, to thrive. And I would hate for everyone to be coming up with different measures that are all, because none of these are perfect. And if a bunch of different groups are coming up with measures that are 90% good, but they're different, we're really limiting ourselves and coming up with ones that are pretty much as good, but aligned, and we can take advantage of data from other sources that are out there.
Great. Okay. Very helpful, David. I think you're also touching on the deciduous, right? Metrics. What is a discrete goal and metric? And the idea of a work group that can really home in on what is our definition? How do we refresh it? And how do we then contextualize this in the affordable housing shortage conversation and priority? Okay, so I would love to hear, Venkat, if you don't mind, because I do want to hear more thoughts on your comment, but Sarah, if you don't mind, we'll jump to you, because I think your Colorado example is sort of squarely on this topic, right? Of how are we measuring overall well-being and ability for people
And
to
maybe
afford.
I just like someone who, you know, is trying to distill information down quickly and then reporting back out to a very busy person. I just immediately start thinking about how we visualize these metrics, and in a way that provides text and include some of the supporting kind of measures we've been talking about, and do just really like how Colorado has identified not just one wage, but a progression. And you can imagine, as we're working through the different metrics for the industry sectors, you can imagine, you know, matching some of the education, training, the skills, the job types to a progression. Because I think that's essentially what the Workforce and Talent Development Board is charged with. And so if we could somehow figure out how to align on a set of metrics, that's a progression. I really like how they have outlined it. And you can imagine having that's your overall, and then you could drill down to some specific industry sectors.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Wow. That is great. Okay. Just catching up on the comments here. So I think a lot of confirmation that there are data points to collect here specifically related to housing and housing affordability. I am really interested in this job progression thing, Sarah. Thanks for sharing the link. So folks, make sure you check that out because I think it will give us some good ideas. Venkat, if you don't mind, I would like to come back to you. Your comment, collecting performance metric data, leaning on industry to provide the supply, demand, wage data per sector. And then you say augment, disaggregate, and curate with partner agencies. Can you extrapolate a little bit on that?
Yeah, in fact, I was looking at that Colorado chart that Sarah forwarded, and I agree that if you're able to drill down by industry sector into a upskilling pipeline, for example, the progression in the technology industry would be from a technician to an engineer, and similarly from an apprentice to a journeyman, etc. So it would be really nice to see that data disaggregated that way. My point was just, doubling down on industry leading metrics so that we can identify the gaps and figure out how to close them, and the board adding value specifically towards recommendations that close the gaps and align with the governor's priorities.
Okay, great. Yep. So here's what I'd like to suggest at this juncture. I think this has been, you're right, a very bold and brave conversation for a sunny Friday afternoon. But in many ways, I think it has confirmed that for imperative number 2, and you'll notice we spend an awful lot of time on imperative number 2. But I think there's good reason for that. I think it's because it is where the shared goals, right, across a larger system have some real potential, and that's where you want it to go. But it seems to me that much of this conversation has confirmed that the metrics in imperative number 2, we haven't talked about increase in payroll. That was one that Ken suggested as one that is doable and could really demonstrate improvements in job seeker and worker because of the system. But we don't need to get into that one right now. The other ones related to living wage, related to housing, adding in the construction pipeline metrics and coming up with ideas there, and then really making sure that we are finding ways to do this by high demand sector. So it does seem that you are continuing to circle around some of the same ideas and concepts. And so I would like to spend the last 20 minutes on some separate topics here. And so if folks are up for that, we're going to move very quickly to what the Workforce Readiness Committee is potentially wanting to focus on. And if I just look and see who we have here, Venkat, you certainly are a good spokesperson for that committee, if that's okay with you, because I'm not seeing Charlie or Tom on. So we might have to put you on the spot there. And then I also want to come back. I love, David, your suggestion of a work group. And so we want to come back to any thoughts on board committee structure, communication lines, and staffing, just to close out. So thoughts or final comments on the conversation that we just had? Okay, great. So is it okay with folks if we then shift? We will shift off of the scorecard. Good. Lots of thumbs up. People are ready to shift off of the scorecard. Okay, great. So I did want to make sure that we had time to just catch you all up on some dig deep conversations that the Workforce Readiness Committee has had, and where they're potentially wanting to go. And so Venkat, do you want to take a stab at that, or would you like me to just quickly summarize what you all discussed on Tuesday and then you add?
Yeah, I think your summary would be helpful, Lindsay, because the Tuesday meeting was the first one I attended after a long time. So it would be helpful if you can summarize things. I might miss out details.
Okay, absolutely. Fair enough. So just so you all know, the Workforce Ready Committee has met 3 times over the same parallel process of when you all have met, even from the retreat. And so we have been able to update the Workforce Readiness Committee and even get input from them on where the plan is going and where metrics are going. And so that has been very helpful, both for them to really make decisions, but also I have mentioned this multiple times whenever I am with the Workforce Readiness Committee. It is a very robust committee. It is remarkable, truly, how many sit on it and how active. And so kudos to the Workforce Readiness Committee for that. So they all have very much agreed with where the imperatives are, where the objectives are, and the themes that have come out of your conversation so far. They also have answered questions for themselves around, are we confirming that the Workforce Readiness Committee really is an umbrella committee that can potentially include a range of topics that we define as workforce ready, including a focus on what those definitions of career readiness and work readiness are. Certainly agree that aligning with governor's priorities as a hook and an ability to actually have impact is important, and a willingness to embrace the definition of the larger workforce system, not just the public workforce system. And that has implications on the priority areas that committee is potentially focusing on, because there is an interest and a leaning into wanting to help address some of the gaps and voids in the K through 12 system, because that has such a profound impact on Oregon's future workforce. And so what has come out of all of their meetings and came out of a 2-hour strategy session earlier this week, was one, there is definitely a desire to quite aggressively promote and expand the OES project and system. But then much discussion also focused on the idea that foundational math at the K through 4 level, especially in Oregon, is in dire straits. And that teachers are under more pressure than ever. Budget cuts have already hit the system. And so their very capacity to do anything about that is extremely limited. And therefore, how do we actually be innovative and bold around AI tools that are out there and potentially can fill gaps, particularly around foundational math? So that is an area that they ended on and are doing research around. And Venkat, I think that's probably where I'll turn it to you to maybe fill in some of the details.
Lindsay, is it okay if I share the same data that I shared with that committee? So I'm just going to try and bring that up in my window. Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen. So this is a set of slides that was presented by Edunomics Lab to the Oregon legislature, and this talks about reading and math proficiency. And so this chart is looking at reading, and the gray line, the thick gray line, is all students, and then it's broken out by race. And the dotted line is inflation, and then what we are spending per pupil and how that has that has exceeded inflation. And the same thing, carries on towards math and the math scores. I mean, there is a drop in both reading and math during the pandemic, and it's not getting better. So we seem to be, we seem to be spending more money, but then the outcomes are just not there. And so Oregon today is 48th in the country when it comes to STEM proficiency, including math proficiency, and we slipped from 46 to 48th. And this is based on the National Assessment Scores. I think it's NAEP scores. So I shared this data with the Workforce Readiness Committee, and then we had some discussions, and I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And so the discussions led to how can we turn this around? And one of the approaches that we are so far behind that we can turn things around if we were able to bring more AI tools into the classroom. Listening to what teachers say that they're overburdened by administrative work and class sizes, and then the fact that every kid learns differently. These tools are so adaptable to be able to help teachers with their administrative burden, with their professional learning and professional development. And then because every kid learns differently, there's a very innate component of personalized learning that these tools provide. And so there are a few examples, and Khan Academy is one. A large component of that is free, but the actual AI tutors for personalized learning for students and the professional development for teachers, which is also AI based, those are paid. And so I had a meeting, in fact, just yesterday, Lindsay, with Khan Academy, trying to understand what their cost structure is and how many states they're in. They're in all 50 states, at least the free version is, but they have partnerships with about 11 or 12 states already. And so I got some details. I'm curating some notes, and I will share them. They're currently in a Google Doc. But Shauna is who is the director for the Technology Industry Consortium for Future Ready. And she and Jeff Rhodes from ODE were in the meeting with Khan Academy. So I'm happy to share those slides, but it feels like this is a tractable solution that we could roll out across school districts, or even start with a single school district like Hillsborough School District. Travis is a member of the WTDB, so I haven't spoken to him yet. But if you could pilot a program, then I'm pretty certain I could convince Khan Academy to give us a free license for a pilot program. It's the cost, just as a quick update, is $15 per student per year. So it's not prohibitive. And if you're able to find funds somewhere to be able to do this, it seems like a really good investment and an opportunity for us to turn this around, because we can't go down, we can only go up, and it's really the slope at which we go up. So that was my quick update.
That's great. Thank you so much, Venkat. And again, we just wanted to provide that update because, once again, the Work Readiness Committee is such a robust and active committee. And so very relevant what areas of focus they are going down. And then I have to imagine, Venkat, that the Work Readiness Committee will, as you go down this path, create the self-assessment metrics, right? The performance metrics for how you as a board and a committee might trigger change here. And then also look at the scorecard and try to assess where do we fit in terms of impact we're having.
Right. And I think we need to look at both short and long-term metrics. It's hard to have this be a short-term metric because this change will take time to realize in terms of proficiency scores. But in the short term, I think focusing on CTE and career-collected learning to me makes sense. And the Readiness Committee can convene across the Future Ready Oregon sectors and figure out how to influence this K-12 problem that we have.
Great. Any quick questions or thoughts on that report out before we go to our last topic? And not to put you on the spot, but I always say that when I'm about to put someone on the spot. Are you get who's nervous? I'm Sarah. Are you still with us, Sarah Foster? Because I'm
Yes.
curious if did you hear anything in that that you're particularly excited about, or that you know the governor, because we know that that K through 12 is also a priority.
In Venkat's presentation.
Yeah, related to
I'm
AI and math.
Yeah, well, not surprising. So I think I'd be curious to see the presentation and follow up on that. And I think we should have a follow-up conversation on that.
Excellent.
That's my
Okay.
answer now.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Follow-up invitations are important. Okay, great. So in the last minutes that we have here, do you all have thoughts or intuitions on any needed changes in board structure, board committees, how the board uses lines of communication and staffing? And this can just be sort of a popcorn up ideas, or throwing ideas out on the table, since we just have a few minutes. Sherry?
Well, I mean, I think mainly really reinforcing, and I think Todd and I talked about this for each board meeting, what the staff is doing, so that I think sometimes board members incorrectly think there is inertia because they don't know what goes on. You know, they're not, it's not clear to them. And that, again, we do have this element where the heck is also helping in some of this. And so I think just every time reinforcing that story and pulling out, I think we had talked about that chart, pulling out some element of that, like, oh, the board, the staff worked on this. This is on our behalf, just to make that connection a little tighter. So that's something I've been saying for a while.
Okay, great. Other quick thoughts, or just sort of what's top of mind going forward?
There was a note in the chat that came.
Oh, thank you. It was on people, I'm not on my chat. Yeah, so that's a great question. I would love other thoughts on that. Julia, committees meet too frequently. Monthly meetings are a lot. I'm also curious about, do you all have the right committees? Is this, and you haven't discussed this with me at all, so maybe you all have had discussions of this in the past, but always a new strategic plan or a revised strategic plan is an opportunity to make sure, do we have the right committees? Do they serve our purposes well? Any reactions to frequency of meetings for Julia, or thoughts on actual committees?
Lindsay, this is David, and I don't know if it has to do with frequency or not, and I don't even know if it's a committee issue or not, but I don't think the board as a whole has done a lot of looking at the performance of the workforce agency programs, the performance of the local workforce boards, what the detailed outcomes are of particular projects and initiatives. We've had presentations on some that have been real useful, but there's not kind of a standardized approach. And I think that's something that the full board should be looking at, and probably doesn't have time on its own to do all the detailed work. So just offering that as a possibility for a committee.
And so this would be a committee that is responsible for consistently looking at program outcomes, initiative outcomes, and report to the board, so the board can make good decisions about potential recommendations going forward. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. Great.
Lindsay, I also wonder, I know there's, sorry, did I interrupt someone? I'm trying to popcorn, so.
Popcorn away.
I also know that knowing that there Clay and Todd, I know how much it takes to run a meeting and schedule a meeting and do the follow-up after the meeting. So as much as you can leverage other tables that are working, there's so much work going on, both at the HEC and outside the HEC, working on workforce, sector-specific workforce strategies. I know Venkat talked about one, being the Technology Industry Consortium. So as much as you can leverage that work rather than duplicate, especially as you're thinking about the scorecard and metrics and the work associated with it, the better.
Great. That's great. And that confirms comments that we have heard previously too. How are we really leveraging and using those consortia that are already stood up? Okay. Anything else? I'm looking in the chat. Maybe I'm the only one who's not understanding the Julia, that seems like a great purpose for the kick. Can you, is that what related to David's comment?
Yeah, what David said. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, great suggestion. Okay, good. All right. Well, I think we can wrap this up for a sunny Friday. Thank you, everyone. There is a lot here. It is on me now that we've had these 3 Fridays in a row of planning sessions to really dig back and look in and make sure that we are not missing some key pieces. Your discussion every Friday has been really, really rich and quite deep. And the chat comments have been very, very active. My email is the same, lindsay@woolseygroup.com. And so any thoughts that you have going forward and coming out of this, please shoot my way. I am going to be spending the next probably 2 weeks really working with some of you individually and sending questions out. I will try not to inundate, just to make sure that we are refining still in a really transparent way and with all of your input. But it will be more one-on-one and behind the scenes before I present back to you where your plan and your scorecard is. So input welcome along the way. Anything else, Sherry, for the good of the order from you?
No, just thank you, Lindsay, for, this is not easy. Like you said, Zoom isn't easy. A sunny day isn't easy. I'm leaving for Belize at 11 p.m. tonight, so that's also not easy. So it's a lot going on with folks. So I appreciate people coming and putting their thinking hats on. And I do feel like we are moving forward. I know it can be weird making the sausage, but hopefully it'll taste delicious when we get there. But yeah, thank you. Thank you all for your time and have a good afternoon.
Okay. Thanks,
All
everyone.
right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.